Welcome back to Levant TV's press review for Thursday, the 28th of November 2013. I'm Khalil Al-Khawairi. Today we will look at analysis on the ongoing Syrian crisis and the effects of the recent Geneva nuclear deal on the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. But as usual, let's start with papers here in the UK. The Guardian leads its front page with reports that Boris Johnson last night launched a bold bid to claim that mantle of Margaret Thatcher by declaring inequality to be essential to fostering a spirit of envy. It also reports on NHS launching a new TripAdvisor-style website to allow patients to post complaints online, including those containing potentially derogatory comments about medical staff, and features pictures of Elisabetta and Francesca Grillo, the two former assistants of Nigel Lawson, who are charged with fraud over 4 years. The Independent leads its front page with reports that the radical plan to allow Britons to vote in parliamentary elections using the internet to be drawn up by the Commons speaker's John Bercow as part of a drive to bridge the divide between politicians and the public. The Daily Telegraph leads its front page breaking the news that the National Crime Agency has arrested 6 men over claims of match fixing in British football. The investigation is set to focus on a suspected illegal international betting syndicate. It also looks at the chairman of the inquiry into mid-staffs, Robert Francis, who says reports of disturbing, poor and unsafe care in the NHS have become too common, as he called on hospitals to learn from the mistakes of previous scandals and continuous coverage on the Lawson-Saatchi court case. And the Times leads its front page with news that cigarettes are to be sold in plain packaging before the next general election, as Prime Minister Cameron tried to head off claims from the Labour Party that he is in the hock of the tobacco lobby. It also reports on Nigella Lawson's housekeeper taking up to £685,000 sterling from her husband's credit cards before claiming that the money was in exchange for covering up the celebrity chef's decade-long cocaine habit. And now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. With the growing number of jihadis fleeing from their home countries to fight in Syria, let's take a look at the growing conflict in the country. Walid Abul Khair for Eurasia Review looks at the growing threat of Al-Qaeda in Syria in his article, Syria, Al-Qaeda seeks to indoctrinate school children. Abul Khair looks at the Syrian businessman Basil Al-Hardan, who left Idlib province for Cairo with whom he went with his children. Al-Hardan says his 13-year-old twin daughters and 10-year-old son had been suffering from the presence of militant groups attempting to impose their own interpretation of Islamic Sharia on students and teachers. Al-Hardan says the state of education is near catastrophic in the opposition-held areas and the conditions are not conducive to an educational atmosphere. The militant Islamist groups are using their power to influence the educational boards in schools and are forcing principals to separate the sexes, even in schools with not many students or teachers. Abu Hardan says that some militants preached to students while they were at school about jihad and other such issues and attempted to brainwash the children in order to later recruit them into their ranks. Abul Khair adds that several weeks ago, the ISIL elements stormed the school in Tariq al-Bab and forced the teaching staff to leave the school at gunpoint, claiming they were male teachers teaching female students. They ordered school officials to stop teaching until an all-female teaching staff became available. He mentions Hisham al-Mallah, former administrative staff member in Aleppo's educational district, who says the war in Syria has started to directly impact the level of education in the country. Each faction is trying to take advantage of the younger generation to serve their purposes. He adds that it is essential that the needs of these students be met and that a suitable educational atmosphere be established for them, rather than focusing on issues such as the Islamic dress code or separating the sexes, as the jihadist groups are doing. Thomas Hegemer writes for The Washington Post, taking a look at the increasing amount of jihadists entering Syria in his article, Number of foreign fighters from Europe in Syria is historically unprecedented. Who should be worried? Hegemer asks, since 2011 large numbers of European Muslims have gone to Syria to fight with the rebels, but exactly how many are they, and which countries are providing most of the fighters? The question matters because some of the most foreign fighters may return to perpetrate attacks in the West, and Western governments are now grappling with the question of how design and calibrate countermeasures. He points out that assessing the terrorist threat to Europe from the foreign fighters in Syria is tricky. On the one hand, foreign fighters are much more likely to engage in international terrorism than the general Muslim population, and they produce more lethal attacks than do plotters without foreign fighting experience. On the other hand, only a small proportion of Western foreign fighters tend to come home to attack. Hegemer looks at results from national estimates provided by the European intelligence services over the past 6 to 7 months, which show the scale and distribution of foreign fighters. He notes that at least 1,200 European Muslims have gone to Syria since the start of the war. This is a remarkable figure. We are talking about the largest European Muslim foreign fighter contingent to any conflict in modern history. But he adds that the problem is not equally serious for all countries. The absolute size of the contingent is not necessarily the best indicator of the scale of the threat, because larger countries have more resources to throw at the problem, noting that 10 prospective terrorists is a greater problem for Luxembourg than for the United States. Hegemer adds that not all foreign fighters are radicalized Muslims, and not all radicalized Muslims are interested in foreign fighting. There are also constraint factors that may make it easier to travel to Syria from certain countries than from others. He concludes that the number of European foreign fighting in Syria is alarmingly high and historically unprecedented. Moreover, France, Germany and the UK may have the largest foreign fighter contingents in Syria, but Denmark, Norway, Belgium and Austria have contributed a much higher proportion of their population. Given that police resources are limited, these countries may have a larger problem on their hands than do bigger European neighbors. Writing for Syria Times, Mustafa looks at the Battle of Kalamoun, where he says that the focus nowadays is intensively being put on the Battle of Kalamoun of Damascus countryside, to the degree that some in the West think that by the end of this battle, the war in Syria will come to an end. Mustafa looks at why the Battle of Kalamoun is so important and who is fighting there. Looking at the strategic and geographical importance of Kalamoun, Mustafa says the area of Kalamoun has strategic, geographical, cultural, humanitarian and military importance both for Syria and Lebanon. It contains the route for most arms supplies and terrorist infiltrations into Syria from Lebanon. The strategic route which links Damascus to the Syrian internal, coastal, northern and eastern areas also goes through Kalamoun. Taking a look at who is fighting there, Mustafa says thousands of foreign-backed gunmen, Wahhabi Takfiri terrorists as well as Al-Nusra Front and Al-Qaeda-linked armed terrorist groups gathered in Kalamoun to fight Syria state and implement a foreign agenda aiming to dominate the entire region through feeding sedition and hatred and through keeping countries of the region in a state of everlasting conflict. The writer adds that the gangs in Kalamoun have been committing crimes against civilians who don't obey their orders, launching attacks against the Syrian military personnel, infrastructure and properties, and blocking the vital road between Damascus and Homs. He continues to take a look at why Kalamoun, saying that the terrorists thought that the mountainous nature of the area may make it difficult for the Syrian army to control it. However, advancing towards clearing the whole Kalamoun area from terrorists, the Syrian army regained full control over Kara town, drove terrorists out and eliminated many of them, this imposing a tight siege on the armed groups. Mustafa says that according to the military experts, the inevitable victory of the Syrian army in Kalamoun leads to full control over the routes of arms supplies across the borders with Lebanon. It also closes the eastern entrance of Kalamoun towards the central region, therefore putting an end to the infiltration of army terrorist groups and the smuggling of weapons into Syria. He says military Lebanese expert Amin Htait points out the victory in Kalamoun will give a big blow to Saudi Arabia's scheme to promote the Wahhabi Takfiri culture in Syria. Also, terrorism resources, mainly those common across the Turkish borders, will gradually be doomed to drought, particularly after Turkey is forced to reconsider its policies. The Syrian army's success in Kalamoun will hopefully pave the way for more victories in Aleppo and other Syrian provinces until Syria is completely free of terrorism. Following the Iran nuclear deal agreement, political analysts are wondering what the effect would be on the Palestinian cause, specifically the current Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. Let's take a look at various opinions on the matter. Al-Monitor features an article headlined, Iran deal expected to slow Palestinian-Israeli talks, in which the writer Dawood Kuttab discusses why the breakthrough in Iran's nuclear talks may prompt Israel to drag its feet in its own US-sponsored talks with the Palestinians. According to Kuttab, the issue seems strange as there is no direct relationship between the Iranian nuclear file and the Palestinian issue, but in reality, the signing of the agreement, especially in light of Israel's public opposition to it, puts Israel's relationship with its biggest ally, the United States, in a difficult situation. Kuttab sees that Washington's apparent unwillingness to take Israel's public opposition to the Iran deal into consideration puts a major question mark on future relationships between the US and Israel. Kuttab believes that Israel's criticism of the White House could go in at least two opposing directions. The US can use the success of the unprecedented international consensus and move in a more aggressive direction to press Israel to make serious concessions in the peace talks, might also be more willing to put forward new ideas for solving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The writer cites a recent personnel decision that gave an indication of Washington's interest in putting forward a plan for solving the conflict. Kuttab refers to Martin Indyk, who had recently hired Israeli-American dual national David Makovsky, who had been prepared maps to illustrate how a two-state solution can actually be implemented on the ground. Kuttab argues, however, that on the other hand, the United States might slow down rather than try to speed up the peace talks coming out of the current public confrontation. The last thing that the White House might want is another war of words with Israel. This line of thinking might mean that the United States will try to make it up to Israel by trusting it more on Palestine than it did on Iran. Kuttab notes that the Israelis don't trust Iran and don't believe the United States shouldn't trust it. If the issue of trust bleeds into the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, the problems there will again be magnified. Israel doesn't trust Palestinians to gain sovereignty over many parts of their future state, including the Jordan Valley. Israel also doesn't trust the possibility of placing a multinational force in the Jordan Valley in place of Israeli occupation forces. Kuttab wonders, if Israel is not convinced that the Iranian deal will make Israel safer, why would Israel trust the Americans on anything to do with the much closer case of the Palestinians? To conclude, Israelis predict that once the economic sanctions on Iran start to ease, the international community will lose its ability to pressure Iran to ensure that its nuclear plans have no military viability. A permanent agreement will certainly deflate Netanyahu's public criticism and weaken his continued attempts to call out the wolf. Gershom Baskin, co-chairman of IPCRI, the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, writes an editorial for the Jerusalem Post headlined Encountering Peace, the P5+1, in which he discusses whether Israel will withdraw from the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations following the Iran nuclear agreement. Baskin argues that there was an understanding between Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu that the US will deliver Iran and Israel would then deliver Palestine. That is the only explanation I can find for Netanyahu's commitment and follow-through on continued negotiations and on the release of Palestinian prisoners who killed Israelis, says Baskin. Moreover, Baskin believes that Netanyahu knows what an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement looks like and the concessions that he will have to make for an agreement to go against his grain. Nonetheless, he was really trying to move forward with the Palestinians against all the international pressure from within himself, his own party, and the government. Baskin notes that Netanyahu's expectations regarding the agreement with Iran were simply unrealistic. No agreement could have been achieved that would put a complete end to Iran's nuclear program. Baskin claims if Netanyahu decides to withdraw from the negotiations with the Palestinians, no longer feeling obligated to them, he should expect the possibility that the P5+1 will take action to convene Geneva II, focusing on this conflict whose solution was wide international consensus. He points out that there are many interested parties, many of whom are stakeholders who would be happy to sit at the table and work out a deal on the fulfillment of the two-state solution. Baskin sees that the establishment of international compliance and verification regime for Israeli-Palestinian peace is an essential aspect of a successful peace agreement, and the new model of international diplomatic responsibility in resolving disputes and preventing war could be a very good way to create it. To conclude, Baskin's failure of the parties to put an end to this conflict could easily bring about a global commitment to insist that it does in fact happen, with the two parties kickling and screaming all the way to an agreement. The Chinese Global Times newspaper features the director of the Institute for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Peking University, Chen Yi, who writes an article headlined, "Now is the best time to seek a peace deal for both Palestine and Israel." Yi sees that if it is the season for deals, just a few months after the US, Russia and other partners reached a deal to eliminate Syria's chemical weapons stocks, and the nuclear deal with Iran has now limited the country's ability to create nuclear weapons and feed the oil revenues that its people desperately need. Continuing this spirit of cooperation, the best time to forge a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians is now. Yi believes that Mahmoud Abbas's gesture to wait until the end of the peace talks before applying for membership in the UN and other world bodies demonstrated his commitment to peace. Yi claims that now the ball is in Israel's court: stop building further settlements or risk yet another failed peace effort. Yi points out that the current environment in the Middle East, with Hamas' strength and popularity at its lowest, the Gulf states and other Sunni Arab countries gravitating towards Israel because of their concerns over Iran's nuclear program, the Muslim Brotherhood's strength waning, and Syria and Iraq still in turmoil, makes the settlement of the conflict with the Palestinian Authority more desirable than ever, since such a deal would allow Israel to focus on other existential threats. Yi goes on to say that on the Palestinian side, President Abbas has never been stronger politically. He is now willing to make the hard decisions to forge an agreement, which he has been unable to do in the past. However, Yi sees that even when Israel is dealt the upper hand, its preoccupation with several issues has prevented it from making the leap forward, achieving a comprehensive peace deal with the Palestinians. First, Israel's fixation on an absolute security and the harsh measures it employs are making the Palestinians vulnerable and ever more humiliated. The writer goes on to say that the extra miles Israel is gaining in defensible territory make little difference in the age of rockets and precision missiles. Construction of fences and walls at high speeds does not bring much improvement in Israel's image, nor does it foster international sympathy for its citizens. Second, since the Oslo Accords in 1993, the number of illegitimate Israeli settlers in the West Bank has tripled from 110,000 to over 340,000 today. Yi indicates that the settlements have led to protests by the Palestinians, as demonstrated by the resignation of the negotiation team, and thus to halt of any meaningful progress. They have to also set the stage for further escalation of violent confrontations and for the potential eruption of a third intifada. And to conclude, he quotes former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert saying that peace now would be freeing Israel from the bondage of the debilitating occupation and the dangerous erosion of Israel's moral standing. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. The UAE's Gulf News dedicates its entire front page to celebrations after the UAE wins the 2020 Expo bid. The International New York Times leads its front page with the headline, "Berlusconi is expelled from Senate and era ends," after the former Prime Minister is stripped off his seat after 2 decades. And Russia's Moscow Times leads its front page with the headline, "Shameful Red Square display ousted," as the Kremlin steps in after public outcry over the placement of a gigantic Louis Vuitton suitcase in the heart of the Russian capital. And finally, the Tehran Times leads with the headline, "Iran-Turkey to cooperate in Syria, Zarif." That was all for today. I'll see you tomorrow for another analytical press review.